But nevertheless, if you pass this, you get the silver medal, and this is quite a difficult hurdle to pass. I've read a lot of articles looking at like this not being met, and when this does not get met, or if any of these not get met, then you can sort of partially have partial invariance. In that case, what you do is you allow less restrictions on the constraints. Maybe some of the loadings are relieved of this constraint, and some others are not relieved of the constraint. You can at least get partial invariance in that case. But nevertheless, let's say we got full invariance in this case, and we can move on to the next level. The next level is strict invariance. And this, you deserve the gold medal you get because you're putting on even more constraints on the model and the measure. And if you do this, then, well, I would say if you are able to maintain or have full scalar invariance, then you can honestly compare all your groups, mean differences between your groups. With strict invariances, perhaps there's really no bounds. It's really just saying that your measure is not biased at all. I mean, there's so little bias, if there is any bias. There's so little bias. There's always going to be some bias in your measure. But it's very little bias that, according to measurement variance, it doesn't really matter so much. You can compare your groups with your heart's content. Now here's where I give my 2 cents, whatever it's worth, about measurement invariance. And in this case, I think that measurement invariance has a lot of strengths to it. And one of the strengths is that it really does have a way to improve the robustness of our measure. There's a lot of mathematical parts to it that allow for it to accurately and consistently assess groups and make sure that there is this integrity that's maintained within the measure. But nevertheless, I think that there are some real weaknesses to this particular approach. One is that Wezo and colleagues found was if you have more than 15 or 20 groups, in their case, they were comparing at least 20 groups in one of their studies, and they found that they could not get measurement invariance. Nevertheless, other ways in which to test for the integrity or the robustness of their measure were met, but for whatever reason, when they had more than 20 groups, it was an unrealistic setting or metric in order to make sure that these groups weren't biased. Of course, there's always going to be bias, and if you got all these groups, it's just not going to pan out as being this perfect measurement invariance design. And some advocates of measurement invariance, at least, have this sort of purist approach where it's kind of like, well, if you don't fulfill measurement invariance, then you can't compare groups. It's kind of like a full stop approach where it's just like, don't pass go if it doesn't, if these assumptions aren't really met, if this way of approaching measurement invariance isn't met. The other concern I have is, okay, well, if measurement invariance isn't met, then what happens is you have to go kind of to the drawing board and take some items out of your depression scale. And this example, I was using the depression scale, and sort of like trim around the bush and make sure that you have a certain amount of measures that do work and operate across the various cultural groups or subpopulations of various kinds. And in this case, if you drop items and you keep on dropping items, it's becoming more of a narrow measure that you have. And so it's, in my opinion, distorting the measure. And we have less of a authentic, and I hate to mean like cool, it's not really a cool measure or just like original measure or whatever the case may be, but it just really tests the sort of the integrity of the measure. If your measure wants to be as flexible as possible, and I think that this sort of crystallizes it and makes it less flexible than it could be if we keep on sort of trimming and standardizing things to conform to this sort of what I think is kind of like a measurement invariance box. And so those are sort of my criticisms of it, but this is kind of like beyond my pay grade because there's so many different levels or ways in which to look at measurement invariance. Oh, there's one other thing I wanted to mention, and this has to do with a concept called triangulation. And with triangulation, what we are trying to do is look at various ways in order to make sure a measure is measuring what it's supposed to be measuring. Basically, when it comes to measures, when it comes to this dispersion scale, we don't have any really 100% objective way of measuring things. What we have is a set of tools that can help us identify what we are getting at and what we think we are getting at is what we think we are getting at. So what we are getting at is what we think we're getting at. And we have triangulation in order to do this, which is multiple different ways to have some confidence that what is happening is what is happening. So as an example, let's say we have this depression scale and we use interview questions to assess depression. Then we use a questionnaire. Then we use raters looking at behaviors. And so let's say we have judges, like maybe there's like 10 judges looking at behaviors. And they all come to the same assessment that this is depression behaviors and these are positive, optimistic behaviors and non-depression behaviors. And maybe you use various other approaches or various other fields in order to look at something. So that's the basic crux of triangulation, and we hope to see that more and more. But of course, when we're talking about measurement invariance, we're not talking about necessarily constructs. It's looking at latent constructs, and so that I think is maybe a different concept than what triangulation can necessarily cover. But if I was to go down this rabbit hole and look at measurement invariance, one very clear example would be, okay, there is this way in which men and women interact with each other when it comes to courtship and mating, and the preference that men have is a hip-to-waist ratio of a certain degree. And in the case of men all around the world, there was a group of researchers, I think Gad Saab was the one who mentioned this or brought this to my awareness. And if you ever get a chance on YouTube, listen to his talks on various topics. They're very, very informative. But in this one talk, I think he was talking to Google, and he was mentioning that the waist to hip ratio is consistently the same across 47 different cultures. And that was just one way to approach the consistency of the waist to hip ratio, or the hourglass figure. And then another way was they looked at female escorts hip to waist ratio, and what they found was either whether the escorts were advertising or given accurate assessments, the average was around 0.7. And then another set of studies looked at art and sculpting designs throughout history, and what they found was throughout the various cultures in history, the hip to waist ratio was about 0.7. And then another study looked at blind men and how blind men judge hip to waist ratio. And of course, if you can't see, one way you can do it is by giving them mannequins and say, well, which mannequin do you prefer? And they prefer the mannequins with the hip to waist ratio. They just kind of felt up their mannequin and made the judgments that way. And they prefer the hip to waist ratio about 0.7. And so that's just one way in which you can look to see if your measure is measuring what it's supposed to be measuring across cultures and across groups. And so I look forward to your comments and questions and concerns on this. What do you guys think about measurement invariance? Is it something that should be approached in the all-stop manner, or should we have a little bit more flexibility as we develop more things when it comes to psychometrics? Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to talk to you soon.